The sun did not forgive anyone that day, baking the mud of the street into hard, cracked puzzles that hurt to look at. In the center of the town square, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, chewing tobacco, and the stifling, dry heat of a mid-July afternoon. Lynn stood on the raised wooden platform, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned the color of old parchment. She was 25 years old, a woman grown, yet in this moment she felt smaller than a grain of rice in a sack of feed. The red silk of her cheongsam, embroidered with golden phoenixes that promised luck she did not feel, clung to her skin, a vibrant scream of color against the endless browns and grays of the frontier. It was a dress meant for a wedding, for joy, but here it felt like a target. The men of the town stood in a loose semicircle, hats tipped back, eyes narrowed, not just against the glare, but in skeptical assessment. They had come for wives, for women to cook their meals and warm their beds in this lonely territory. But they looked at Lynn as if she were an object they did not know how to use. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like grinding stones, wiped sweat from his brow and gestured to her with a dismissive wave of his hand. Lynn kept her eyes on the dusty boots of the man in the front row, afraid to look up, afraid to see the rejection etched into their bearded faces. She whispered a mantra in her mind, a quiet rhythm to match her racing heart. Nobody picks me. Nobody sees me. It was a truth she had carried across an ocean, through the crowded ports, and onto the train that had rattled her bones for days until dumping her in this heat. A large man with a belly that strained his suspenders stepped forward, squinted at her, and then spat into the dirt near the hem of her red silk. "Too thin," the man grumbled, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "And she don't look like she can pull a plow. What use is a China doll out here?" Laughter rippled through the group, sharp and jagged. Lynn flinched, the humiliation burning hotter than the sun. The auctioneer sighed, clearly eager to be done with the business. "Anyone? She's healthy, and she's quiet. That's a virtue, ain't it?" Silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Lynn felt the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over and complete her shame. She prepared herself to step down, to accept that she was unwanted even in a place desperate for women. Then a shadow detached itself from the back of the crowd, near the water trough where the horses were tied. A man stepped into the light. He was not like the others. He was leaner, his clothes worn white at the seams but clean, his hat pulled low to shade eyes that Lynn could not see. He walked with a slight stiffness, a hesitation that spoke of old injuries or deep shyness. The crowd parted for him, mostly out of confusion. He stopped a few feet from the platform, looking up at her. He did not leer. He did not squint. He simply looked, with a gaze that felt like cool water. He raised one gloved hand, the leather cracked and stained with work. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the buzzing of the flies, but it silenced the snickering. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. "Nathan? You? You barely got enough for your own keep, let alone a wife." The man, Nathan, didn't look at the auctioneer. He kept his eyes on Lynn, seeing the terror she tried to hide. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of coins, tossing it to the man on the stage. Then he extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. "Mine," he said softly, the word not sounding like a claim of ownership, but a promise of safety. Lynn hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs, before slowly, trembling, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The walk away from the town square felt like crossing a bridge between two worlds, leaving the noise of judgment behind for a silence that was both terrifying and vast. There were no wagons for them. Nathan did not own such luxuries, and the path to his land was likely too rough for wheels anyway. He had a horse, a sturdy roan mare with intelligent eyes that nickered softly when Nathan approached, but he did not mount it. Instead, he checked the cinch on the saddle and then looked at Lynn, who stood awkwardly in the dust, her red silk shoes already coated in a fine gray film. He gestured to the saddle. "Up you go," he murmured, his voice rough with disuse. "It is a long way." Lynn stared at the beast, fear spiking in her chest. She had never ridden the horse. In her village, animals were for plowing or eating, not for transport. Seeing her hesitation, Nathan didn't mock her or sigh with impatience. He simply stepped closer, cupping his hands together to form a step. "Trust me," he said. "I will not let you fall." It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that made Lynn obey. She placed her foot in his hands, and with a surprising strength, he hoisted her up. She grasped the saddle horn with a white-knuckled grip, the height making her dizzy. Nathan took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse out of town. They passed the saloon where piano music spilled out like spilled liquor, and the general store where women in bonnets stopped to stare openly at the Chinese woman in red perched on the rancher's horse. Lynn kept her chin down, burning under their gaze. But Nathan did not look left or right. He walked with a steady, rhythmic gait, his boots crunching on the gravel. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into a sprawling ocean of sagebrush and red earth, framed by distant purple mountains that looked like bruised knuckles against the sky. The heat was relentless, shimmering in waves off the ground, but the air here was cleaner, smelling of dry grass and pine resin. For hours, the only sound was the horse's hooves and the steady breathing of the man walking beside her. He did not try to make conversation, for which Lynn was grateful. Her English was broken, pieced together from scraps heard on the journey over, and she feared saying the wrong thing. She watched him from her vantage point. He had broad shoulders, though they were hunched slightly as if he expected a blow. His hat hid his face, but she saw the way his hand occasionally stroked the horse's neck, a gentle gesture that contradicted the harshness of the land. Why had he picked her? The question looped in her mind. He did not look like a man who needed a servant, nor did he look like the cruel men who frequented the brothels near the railroad tracks. He seemed solitary, like a stone in a river, enduring the current alone. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet, Nathan stopped. He pulled a canteen from the saddlebag and uncorked it, offering it to her first. "Water," he said. Lynn took it, her fingers brushing his gloved hand. He didn't pull away, nor did he linger. She drank, the water warm and tasting of tin, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She handed it back, and for the first time, their eyes met fully. His were a startling shade of hazel, flecked with green, and filled with a quiet, guarded curiosity. "Not much further," he told her, capping the canteen. "My place is just over that ridge. It is not much, but it is quiet." Lynn nodded, clutching the red silk of her dress. Quiet sounded like a paradise she had never known. Nathan's home was not the grand estate of a wealthy cattle baron, nor was it the shanty of a drifter. It was a cabin built of rough-hewn logs, sitting in the crook of a valley where a small stream cut through the earth like a silver vein. A small barn stood to the side, leaning slightly against the wind, and a corral held 2 other horses that watched their arrival with pricked ears. As Nathan helped her down from the horse, Lynn's legs buckled, stiff from the ride, and for a second she fell against him. He caught her by the elbows, steadying her, his grip firm but careful, as if she were made of glass. "Easy," he muttered. "Legs need a minute." He waited until she found her balance before stepping back, creating a respectful distance that confused her. In the stories the other women whispered, the men who bought brides were eager to claim their property, to drag them inside and assert their dominance. Nathan seemed more interested in the horse, unbuckling the saddle and rubbing the mare down with a handful of dried grass before he even looked at the cabin. Lynn stood by the door, unsure if she was allowed to enter without permission. The wind tugged at her chongsam, the red silk fluttering like a distress flag. Finally, Nathan walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning under his boots. He pushed the door open and gestured for her to enter. "Go on," he said. "It is open." Lynn stepped over the threshold into the dim interior. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. It was a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the shuttered windows. It was sparse, devoid of the clutter of a family, but it was clean. Nathan followed her in, leaving the door open to let in the evening light. He moved to the fireplace, kneeling to stir the embers of a morning fire, adding kindling with practiced movements. "Hungry?" he asked without looking up. Lynn nodded, though her stomach was tied in knots. "Yes," she whispered, "please." Nathan stood and went to a cupboard, pulling out a tin of coffee and a wrapped parcel of salt pork. He moved with an efficiency that suggested he had lived alone for a long time, knowing exactly where every spoon and skillet lay. While he cooked, Lynn remained standing in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder in this man's private sanctuary. She saw a second door at the back of the room and looked at it curiously. Nathan noticed her gaze. He pointed with the knife he was using to slice the meat. "That room," he said, pausing to find the words, "that is for you. There is a bed and a lock on the inside." Lynn stared at him, her eyes widening. A lock? On the inside? It was a gift of privacy she had not expected, a declaration that she was not a prisoner. "For me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nathan nodded, turning back to the sizzling pan. "A person needs their own space," he said simply. "I sleep out here." The tension in Lynn's shoulders, which she had carried since the auction block, released just a fraction. She walked to the door and opened it. Inside was a small room, bare but for a cot and a wash basin. She stepped in, closed the door, and slid the iron bolt into place. The clack of the metal echoed in the silence. For the first time in months, she was safe. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the door and let out a long, shuddering breath. Days turned into a week, and the rhythm of the ranch began to seep into Lynn's bones, replacing the constant hum of fear with something resembling a routine. She learned that the morning started before the sun, when the sky was still a bruised purple and the air was sharp enough to bite. Nathan would be up first, the sounds of him stoking the fire and boiling coffee serving as her alarm clock. She would emerge from her room, dressed not in the red silk, which she had carefully folded and hidden beneath her mattress, but in a plain cotton shirt and trousers Nathan had found for her in an old trunk, remnants of a life he never spoke about. She rolled up the sleeves and pinned the waist with a piece of rope, looking less like a bride and more like a ranch hand, but it allowed her to work. And work she did. Lynn was not content to sit idle while Nathan toiled. She took over the cooking, transforming his simple supplies of beans, flour, and dried meat into meals that actually had flavor, adding wild herbs she found growing near the creek. She swept the dust that seemed determined to bury them, and she washed the windows until the valley view was clear and bright. Nathan said little, but she caught him watching her sometimes, not with lust, but with a look of puzzled gratitude, as if he couldn't understand why the cabin felt warmer. One afternoon, while Lynn was hanging wet laundry on a line strung between the porch and the barn, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the peace. She froze, her instinct to hide flaring up, but there was nowhere to go. A rider appeared over the ridge, a woman sitting tall on a speckled gelding, wearing a bonnet that did little to hide her severe expression. It was Mrs. Miller, the closest neighbor, though close out here meant a 2-hour ride. She pulled her horse up to the fence, her eyes scanning Lynn with cold disapproval. Lynn bowed her head slightly, a habit of deference she couldn't break. "So," Mrs. Miller said, her voice sharp like a cracking whip, "the rumors are true. Nathan bought himself a heathen. Lynn flinched at the word, clutching the wet shirt to her chest like a shield. Nathan emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, placing himself between the fence and Lynn. "Afternoon, Martha," Nathan said, his tone flat. "To what do I owe the visit?" Mrs. Miller sniffed, looking down her nose at him. "Just checking to see if you'd lost your mind, Nathan. The town is talking. They say it ain't right having her out here. It's indecent. A woman like that brings trouble." Nathan didn't raise his voice, but his posture stiffened, his shoulders squaring. "She has a name," he said quietly. "It's Lynn, and she is my wife." The lie, or was it a lie, hung in the air. They hadn't married in a church, but in the eyes of the law of the transaction, she was his. Mrs. Miller scoffed. "Paper or not, she don't belong. You know how folks are, Nathan. They don't take kindly to difference, especially not now with the drought making everyone mean." She turned her horse, casting one last look of disgust at Lynn. "Watch your back, Nathan. You're inviting a storm." She galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust that drifted over the clean laundry. Lynn looked at Nathan, expecting him to be angry at the trouble she caused. Instead, he turned to her, his face weary. "Pay her no mind," he said, though his eyes were troubled. "People fear what they don't know." He reached out, hesitating, then gently took the wet shirt from her hands to hang it himself. "You belong where you are safe," he added, "and you are safe here." The safety Nathan promised felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a rushing river, especially after Mrs. Miller's visit. The isolation of the ranch, once a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. Every sound of the wind or the settling of the cabin logs made Lynn jump, her eyes darting to the horizon. 2 days later, the real storm arrived, not from the sky, but in the form of 3 men riding up the valley trail. Leading them was a man named Mercer, a figure Lynn had seen in town during the auction. He wore a fine suit that was dusty from the road, and a silver watch chain glinted on his vest. He was the man who owned the bank, the general store, and half the souls in the territory. He rode with the arrogance of a king inspecting his subjects. Nathan was chopping wood near the barn, the axe rising and falling with rhythmic force. When he saw the riders, he didn't stop immediately. He finished the swing, splitting a log cleanly in two, before leaving the axe embedded in the stump and turning to face them. Lynn watched from the kitchen window, her heart hammering against her throat. She wanted to hide, but she knew that if she did, she would be leaving Nathan to face them alone. Trembling, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch, her hands gripping the railing. Mercer chuckled as he pulled his horse to a halt, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Well, look at this," Mercer said, his voice smooth and oily. "The hermit has a guardian angel. Though she looks a bit pale, don't she, boys?" The 2 men behind him, rough-looking hired hands with guns on their hips, laughed on cue. Nathan crossed his arms, his face a mask of stone. "State your business, Mercer. I got work to do." Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Business is exactly why I'm here, Nathan. You missed your payment on the seed loan. Again." Nathan frowned. "I paid it last week. I gave the money to your clerk." Mercer shrugged, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "Clerk says he never saw it. Says you're in default. And you know what the contract says about default." He looked past Nathan, his gaze landing on Lynn with a predatory gleam. "It says I can seize assets to cover the debt." The threat was clear. He wasn't talking about cattle or tools. He was looking at the woman in the doorway. Nathan took a step forward, his hand dropping near the knife at his belt. "You won't touch her," Nathan growled, a low, dangerous sound that Lynn had never heard from him before. "She ain't an asset. She's a person." Mercer straightened up, his jovial demeanor vanishing. "She's property, Nathan. Bought and paid for, just like a heifer. And if you can't pay your debts, maybe I take her off your hands. Call it even." He gathered his reins, signaling his men to ready themselves. "I'll give you 3 days," Mercer spat. 3 days to come up with the full amount, plus interest. Or I come back with the sheriff and we strip this place bare, starting with the girl." He wheeled his horse around, the animal rearing slightly, and galloped off, his men trailing behind. Nathan stood frozen, watching them go, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Lynn walked down the steps, her legs shaking. She reached out and touched his arm. He felt like vibrating iron. "Nathan?" she whispered. He didn't look at her. He stared at the dust cloud, his voice hollow. "They don't want the money, Lynn. They want to break me." He turned to her then, and the fear in his eyes terrified her more than Mercer's gun. "And they're going to use you to do it." Night fell over the valley like a heavy woolen blanket, suffocating the last of the day's heat, but trapping the tension inside the small log cabin. Nathan sat at the rough-hewn table, the oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows that danced across his face, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched into his forehead. He had the ledger open in front of him, but he wasn't reading the numbers. He was staring through the paper, lost in a maze of impossible calculations, where the answer always ended in loss. Lynn moved quietly around the periphery of the light, her presence a soft rustle of fabric against the floorboards. She had made tea, a bitter brew from the last of their supplies, and placed a steaming mug near his hand, but he hadn't touched it. The silence between them was thick, not with distance, but with the shared weight of the coming storm. Lynn watched him, her heart aching for this man who had asked for nothing but peace and had been given a war instead. She saw the way his large, calloused hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table, hands that could calm a spooked horse or mend a fence, but were helpless against the ink-stained malice of a banker. She could not let him drown in this silence. Slowly she approached the table, the wood creaking softly under her weight. She didn't sit opposite him. Instead, she pulled the second chair close to his side, closer than she had ever dared before. Nathan looked up, startled, his hazel eyes wide and unguarded in the dim light. "I am sorry," he rasped, his voice cracking. "I brought you here to be safe, and now—" He trailed off, unable to voice the failure he felt. Lynn reached out, her fingers hovering for a second before settling over his clenched fist. Her skin was pale against his sun-darkened leather, a contrast of porcelain and earth. "You did not bring me here to be safe," she said softly, her English improving with every day of listening to him. "You brought me here to be home." Nathan turned his hand over, catching her fingers in his grip desperate and tender. The roughness of his palm against her skin sent a jolt through her, a current of warmth that chased away the chill of the evening. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a responsibility, but as a woman. "I didn't pick you because you were quiet," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I picked you because you looked like you were holding the whole world up by yourself, and I knew what that felt like." The admission hung in the air, raw and beautiful. Lynn felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and fast. She squeezed his hand, leaning her head until it rested tentatively against his shoulder. He stiffened for a heartbeat, then relaxed, leaning his cheek against her hair. In the circle of lamplight, with the darkness pressing in from all sides, the distance between them collapsed, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. The next morning broke with a deceptive calm, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue that mocked the dread settling in Lynn's stomach. Nathan was already awake when she emerged, moving with a frenetic energy that frightened her. He was packing a saddlebag, not with tools, but with the few items of value he possessed: a silver belt buckle, a small bag of coins, and a sealed envelope. He stopped when he saw her, his face a mask of pained resolve. "You have to go," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'm putting you on the train. I have enough for a ticket to San Francisco. There are communities there, people who speak your language. You'll be safe." He held the bag out to her, his arm rigid. It was a dismissal, a frantic attempt to save her by cutting her loose. Lynn stared at the bag, then at him, feeling a cold anger rise up to meet her fear. She did not take the bag. She walked past him to the stove, picked up the coffee pot, and poured 2 cups with steady hands. "I do not want to go to San Francisco," she said, her back to him. "I do not know San Francisco. I know this valley." Nathan slammed the bag onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Lynn, please. Mercer isn't just a banker. He's a man who takes what he wants. If he comes back and I can't pay..." His voice broke and he ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the roots. "I can't protect you from him if they take the land. I won't let you be part of the inventory." Lynn turned slowly, crossing the room until she stood directly in front of him. She reached up and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look down at her. His skin was rough with stubble, his eyes swimming with panic. "You paid for me once," she said fiercely, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You said, 'mine.' Do you take it back?" Nathan's breath hitched. He covered her hands with his own, pressing them closer to his face, closing his eyes as if in prayer. "Never," he whispered. "Never." Lynn stepped closer, her body pressing against his, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. "Then I stay," she declared. "We are not a debt to be paid, Nathan. We are a family." He let out a long, shuddering sigh, the fight draining out of him, only to be replaced by something stronger, something steelier. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of soap and sagebrush. They stood there for a long time, the dust motes dancing around them, 2 outcasts anchoring each other against the turning tide of the world. He didn't ask her to leave again. The waiting was a physical wait, heavier than any sack of grain, stretching the hours of the second day into an eternity. They worked side by side, not because there was urgent work to be done, but because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant spiraling. They repaired the corral fence, Nathan hammering the nails with grim precision while Lynn held the wood steady, their movements synchronized in a silent dance of labor. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, they retreated to the porch. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of pine and impending autumn. Nathan sat on the steps, whittling a piece of cedar not into a shape, but just shaving it down, strip by strip, a nervous habit. Lynn sat on the bench behind him, watching the muscles in his back shift under his shirt. She reached out and touched his shoulder, her fingers kneading the tension there. He leaned back into her touch instantly, dropping the wood and the knife. "My mother used to say that fear is a thief," Nathan murmured, looking out at the darkening horizon. "It steals today because you are worried about tomorrow." Lynn moved from the bench to sit beside him on the step, their knees touching. She took his hand, the one with the knife callous, and turned it over, tracing the lines of his palm. "Then we do not let it steal tonight," she whispered. She guided his hand to her hair, which she had left unbraided, falling in a dark cascade down her back. It was an intimacy she had never allowed anyone, a vulnerability that spoke louder than any vow. Nathan's fingers tangled in the silk of her hair, clumsy but infinitely gentle. He turned to her, his face inches from hers, the twilight softening his rugged features. "You are beautiful, Lynn," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue, as if he hadn't believed he was allowed to say them. "Not just to look at, but hear." He pressed his hand over her heart. Lynn's breath caught. She leaned in, closing the small distance, and pressed her forehead against his. It wasn't a kiss, but it was something more profound, a sharing of breath, a mingling of souls. In the quiet of the valley, with the threat of tomorrow looming like a thunderhead, they carved out a sanctuary in the space between them. He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her as if to shield her from the very air, and they sat in silence as the stars wheeled overhead, two small sparks of warmth in the vast, indifferent night. The third day arrived with the sound of wheels and the heavy thud of hooves. It was noon when Mercer returned, and he did not come alone. A buggy carried him and the sheriff, a man with a tin star that caught the sun and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Behind them rode 3 deputies, men with rifles resting casually across their saddles. Nathan stood on the porch, his rifle leaning against the wall, not held but within reach. Lynn stood beside him, not behind him. She wore her red cheongsam again, not as a costume of shame, but as armor. The red silk blazed against the gray wood of the cabin, a defiant splash of life. Mercer stepped down from the buggy, dusting off his suit. He looked at the cabin, then at the couple, a smirk playing on his lips. "Time's up, Nathan," Mercer called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Do you have the money?" Nathan stepped forward to the edge of the porch steps. "I told you, Mercer. I paid you. You're thieving, plain and simple." The sheriff shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Now, Nathan," the sheriff rumbled, "Mr. Mercer has the paperwork. Says you're in arrears. If you can't pay, the law says we got to seize the property." Mercer pulled a document from his pocket, waving it like a flag. "It's all here. The land, the livestock, and the chattel." He leered at Lynn. "Grab her, boys." The deputies moved their horses forward. Nathan grabbed his rifle, leveling it at Mercer's chest. The click of the hammer cocking was deafening. "Take one more step," Nathan warned, his voice low and deadly, "and you won't live to sign the deed." The deputies raised their rifles. The air crackled with violence. Suddenly, Lynn stepped in front of Nathan, placing her hand on the barrel of his gun and pushing it gently down. "No," she said clearly. The men paused, surprised by her voice. She looked at the sheriff, her dark eyes blazing. "He paid," she said, her voice ringing out like a bell. "I saw the book." Mercer laughed. "The book? You can't even read, girl." Before he could signal his men again, a new sound came from the ridge, the thunder of many hooves. A group of riders crested the hill, led by Mrs. Miller on her speckled gelding. Behind her were the blacksmith, the feed store owner, and a dozen others from the town. They rode down the slope, forming a wall between the deputies and the porch. Mrs. Miller glared at Mercer, her face pinched with fury. "We saw the book too, Mercer," she shouted. "My husband was in the bank when Nathan handed your clerk that cash. We all know you've been cooking the ledgers to grab land for the railroad coming through." The sheriff looked at Mrs. Miller, then at Mercer, whose face had gone the color of curdled milk. "Is this true, Mercer?" the sheriff asked, his hand drifting to his own gun. "You got witnesses saying otherwise." Mrs. Miller crossed her arms. "The whole town knows Nathan is an honest man, and we know you're a snake. You touch them, you answer to all of us." The silence that followed was heavy, but the threat had shifted. Mercer looked at the angry faces of the townspeople, realized his gamble had failed, and spat on the ground. "Fine," he snarled, climbing back into his buggy. "Keep your dust heap." As the buggy rattled away, Mrs. Miller looked at Lynn. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a sharp, respectful dip of her chin. Lynn squeezed Nathan's hand, and for the first time, the town didn't feel like a cage. Autumn came to the valley in a riot of gold and crimson, the cottonwood trees along the creek turning to fire against the cooling sky. The cabin had changed. There were curtains in the windows now, sewn from calico, and the smell of baking bread was a permanent fixture in the air. Nathan was in the barn mending a harness when Lynn came out to the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the crisp wind. She watched him work, the easy, fluid motion of his hands, and felt a profound sense of peace settle in her chest. They had not just survived, they had rooted. The town had slowly opened its doors to them, awkwardly at first, but with growing respect. Lynn was no longer the heathen bride, but the woman who knew which herbs broke a fever and who made the best heavy bread in the territory. Nathan put down the harness and walked out into the sunlight, wiping his brow. He saw her watching him and smiled, an expression that came easily to his face now, erasing the years of solitude. He walked up the steps, his boots heavy on the wood, and stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything at first, just reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "The winter will be cold," he said softly. "The snow gets deep here." Lynn leaned into his touch, covering his hand with hers. "We have wood," she said. "We have food. We have this place." She paused, looking up into his eyes, seeing the reflection of the golden trees and her own face. "And I have you." Nathan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the chill of the coming season. He rested his chin on the top of her head, looking out over the valley that was no longer just land, but a legacy. "Yes," he whispered into her hair, the word vibrating against her skull, a vow renewed every single day. "Mine." The wind rustled the dry leaves, whispering through the grass, but inside the circle of their arms there was only silence, warm and complete. They turned together and walked back into the cabin, closing the door against the cold, ready to face whatever winter brought, not as buyer and bought, but as two halves of a whole.